Close your eyes for a second and picture the last time you stood over a grill. Maybe it was a backyard cookout, burgers sizzling on a Sunday afternoon, smoke curling up into the air, the smell hitting you before you even open the back door. There's something about that moment that feels almost primal, and that's not just a figure of speech. That feeling is real. That pull you feel toward open fire and slow-cooked meat is not a preference. It is a 2 million-year-old biological memory written into your DNA. And the story of how we got from a prehistoric campfire to a Wi-Fi connected pellet grill is one of the most fascinating, complicated, and honestly heartbreaking journeys in all of human history. So today, we're going all the way back. We're talking about the moment fire changed what it meant to be human. We're talking about the people who invented the techniques that built entire cultures around outdoor cooking, and who were then erased from the very story they authored. We're going to travel from ancient India to medieval Baghdad, from the American South to the suburbs of post-war Chicago. And by the time we're done, the next time you fire up that grill, you're going to see it completely differently. Let's start at the very beginning. 2 million years ago, somewhere on the African continent, one of our distant ancestors did something that had never happened before in the history of life on Earth. They didn't just eat food. They cooked it. Now, we don't know exactly how the first fire was controlled, whether it was sparked by lightning, by volcanic activity, or by sheer curiosity, but what we do know is what happened next, and it changed everything. Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham spent decades studying this question, and his conclusion is genuinely stunning. He argues that cooking food, specifically cooking meat over fire, was not just a convenience. It was the engine of human evolution itself. Here's why. When you cook meat, you break down the tough protein structures and cellular walls that the body would otherwise have to work incredibly hard to digest. Cooked food releases significantly more energy than the same food eaten raw. And that extra energy went somewhere very specific. It went to the brain. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors who cooked their food developed larger, more complex brains. Their digestive tracts actually shrank because they no longer needed the enormous gut that raw food-eating primates require. They had more time, more energy, and more cognitive capacity. Wrangham's argument is that cooking, not tools, not language, not agriculture, was the single defining hinge point of human history. Everything else followed from the fire. By around 400,000 years ago, early humans weren't just stumbling onto existing fires anymore. They were deliberately making them, controlling them, and using them to prepare food. And here's the remarkable thing, this didn't happen in one place and spread outward. Evidence shows that the instinct to cook over fire developed independently across multiple continents. In Africa, in Europe, in Asia, separate groups of early humans, who had never met and never communicated, all arrived at the same discovery. Fire and meat, together, was an idea whose time had come. Now fast forward a few 100,000 years, and let's talk about the word itself, because the history of the word barbecue is actually a story of colonization, erasure, and survival. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, he and his crew encountered the Taíno people, the indigenous inhabitants of what we now call Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and surrounding islands. The Taíno had been living there for thousands of years, and they had developed a cooking technique that was genuinely sophisticated. They built a raised wooden framework, a structure of green sticks elevated above hot coals, and they used it to slow cook meat over low, indirect heat and smoke. They called this structure a barbacoa. Spanish explorers documented the technique, brought it back to Europe, and it spread. The word traveled. It transformed over centuries into the English barbecue, and every single time someone uses that word today, at a restaurant, on a bag of chips, on a sauce bottle, they are, whether they know it or not, speaking a word that belongs to the Taíno people. But here's the tragedy. Within a single century of European contact, the Taíno were nearly wiped out entirely. Disease, forced labor, and systematic violence devastated their population. And with them went the direct credit for one of the most beloved culinary techniques in the world. The colonizers documented the food. They adopted the method. They kept the word. And they forgot, or chose to forget, who taught them. This pattern of adoption and erasure would repeat itself, in an even more painful way, in the American South. Let's talk about the history that tends to get left out of the cookbooks and the Food Network specials and the glossy barbecue competition shows. In colonial and antebellum America, barbecue wasn't a backyard hobby. It was a massive communal event, a public institution. Political rallies, church gatherings, harvest celebrations, town-wide feasts, these were all organized around enormous open-pit barbecues. And when you're feeding hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, the cooking is not a casual affair. It requires skill, endurance, and a mastery of fire that takes years to develop. That mastery belonged to enslaved black men. On plantations throughout the South, enslaved people were assigned the grueling, all-night labor of tending the pits. They worked through the darkness, managing the heat with extraordinary precision, without thermometers, without timers, without any of the equipment we take for granted today. They learned by feel, by instinct, by the color of the smoke, by the way the fat rendered off the meat. They developed the regional flavor traditions that we still celebrate today. The vinegar-based sauces of the Carolinas. The slow-smoked whole hog. The particular marriage of wood smoke and thyme that defines genuine Southern barbecue. These were not accidents. These were innovations, developed by skilled human beings under conditions of profound injustice. And then history did what history so often does to the stories of the marginalized. It rewrote them. By the 1830s, white historians and journalists were actively reshaping the narrative. The expertise, the labor, the genius of black pit masters was attributed instead to European colonists. The story became one of Southern tradition rooted in white culture. The actual authors of the tradition were pushed to the margins or removed from the story entirely. It took generations of dedicated food historians, researchers, and writers, many of them black, to begin recovering and restoring that truth. When you eat great Southern barbecue today, you are eating the legacy of people who were never paid, never credited, and never thanked. That's worth knowing. That's worth saying out loud. Now, while all of this was unfolding in the Americas, the rest of the world was doing its own extraordinary things with fire and meat, and often, they were doing them completely independently of each other. Consider India. 5,000 years ago, in the cities of the Indus Valley civilization, one of the earliest and most sophisticated urban cultures in human history, someone developed the tandoor. The tandoor is a cylindrical clay oven, partially buried in the ground, that generates intense dry heat from a fire burning at its base. You slap leavened bread against its inner walls. You hang marinated meat from iron skewers that descend into the heat. The result is a cooking method of remarkable efficiency and remarkable flavor, the charred edges, the smoky depth, the way the fat drips down into the coals and sends up that fragrant smoke that bastes the meat as it cooks. The tandoor is still in use today, in essentially the same form, across South Asia and much of the world. 5,000 years, and the design hasn't needed to change. Travel west, to the medieval Middle East, and you find culinary literature that puts most modern barbecue writing to shame. 13th century cookbooks from Baghdad, one of the great intellectual capitals of the medieval world, contain precise, detailed instructions for coal grilling techniques. These weren't rough field notes. They were refined recipes, specifying coal temperatures, marinades, timing, and presentation. The culture of grilling in the Arab world was already ancient and sophisticated by the time European cuisine was still figuring out basic spit roasting. And then there are the traditions that aren't just about the food, they're about what the food means. In South Africa, the braai is more than a cooking method. It is a social institution, a cultural identity, a ritual that cuts across racial and ethnic lines in a country where very little else does. You don't just throw some meat on the braai. You gather. You stay. You tend the fire together. The word itself has become a verb, a noun, and almost a spiritual practice. In Argentina, the asado carries the same weight. It is the art of slow cooking over wood-burning coals, presided over by a designated asador who takes the responsibility with complete seriousness. An asado is not fast food. A proper asado can take the better part of a day. It is an act of hospitality, of community, of national identity. Every family has opinions about the right wood, the right cut, the right timing. It is, in every meaningful sense, a living tradition. What strikes you when you look at all of these traditions together, the tandoor, the Baghdad grill masters, the braai, the asado, the Taíno barbacoa, is how universal the impulse is. Human beings on opposite ends of the globe, with no contact with each other, all independently concluded that the best way to bring people together was around smoke and fire and slow-cooked meat. That's not a coincidence. That is something deep about who we are. Now let's move forward to the 20th century, because this is where barbecue gets democratized, where it goes from a public spectacle or a cultural ritual to something that happens in your own backyard on a Tuesday night. And it happens because of some genuinely interesting characters and genuinely weird accidents of history. First, we need to talk about Henry Ford and the charcoal briquette. Because this is one of those stories that sounds made up but is completely real. In the early 1920s, Henry Ford was the most successful industrialist in America. His factories were producing automobiles at a scale that had never been seen before. And those factories were also producing an enormous amount of waste, specifically, wood scraps and sawdust left over from the wooden framing used in the cars of that era. Ford was a man who hated waste in any form. He needed a solution. He found one in his relative by marriage, a man named Edward Kingsford. Together, They built a wood distillation plant that compressed the sawdust and wood scraps into small, uniform, easily ignitable fuel units. They were basing this on a largely forgotten 1897 patent by an inventor named Ellsworth Sawyer, who had developed the concept of the compressed charcoal briquette but never successfully commercialized it. Ford and Kingsford took the idea, scaled it up, and started selling the product through Ford car dealerships. Yes, you could buy charcoal at the same place you bought your Model T, marketing it as the ideal fuel for outdoor cooking. The company that grew from this partnership still bears Kingsford's name today. And the compressed charcoal briquette became the fuel that powered the great American backyard barbecue revolution. But the fuel was only part of the equation. Because in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as American veterans came home from World War II and the country went on a suburban building boom, a new problem emerged. Millions of families now had backyards. They had the space. They had the desire to cook outdoors. What they had for equipment, though, was deeply inadequate. The standard backyard grill of that era was a flat, shallow, open pan on legs. It worked, after a fashion, but it worked badly. Flare-ups were constant. Wind was a nightmare. Maintaining any kind of consistent temperature was essentially impossible. Food burned on the outside and stayed raw in the middle. The experience was frustrating enough that a lot of people gave up on outdoor cooking altogether. Enter George Stevens Sr. George was a welder at the Weber Brothers Metal Works in Chicago, a company that made, among other things, large metal marine buoys for use in the water. One day in 1952, looking at the stack of buoy halves sitting around the factory, George had an idea. He took the bottom half of a buoy, welded on 3 legs, put a grate inside it, and put the top half on as a lid. He brought this strange contraption home and tried cooking on it. The results were revelatory. The dome-shaped lid trapped the heat and circulated it around the food, cooking it evenly from all sides. The vent holes allowed precise control of the airflow, which meant precise control of the temperature. Flare-ups were dramatically reduced. The food cooked slower, more evenly, and with infinitely more flavor. George refined the design, added a handle to the lid, and started selling the grills out of his station wagon. The response was immediate. The Weber kettle was born, and it is still considered by many serious grillers to be the most elegant and effective charcoal grill ever designed. It has barely changed in 70 years. Now, while George Stevens was revolutionizing American backyard grilling, something else was happening on the other side of the world that would eventually reshape outdoor cooking once again. When American GIs occupied Japan after World War II, many of them encountered a traditional Japanese cooking vessel called a kamado, specifically, a heavy-walled clay vessel called a mushi kamado, used for both steaming and smoking food. Some soldiers were so impressed by these vessels that they brought them home as souvenirs. And for decades, those kamados sat in American kitchens and garages as curiosities. In 1974, an entrepreneur named Ed Fisher traveled to Japan, encountered the kamado design, and recognized its potential. But he didn't simply import the clay version. He worked with engineers to recreate the design using aerospace-grade ceramic materials, the same type of high-performance ceramics used in industrial applications. The result was a cooker of extraordinary thermal efficiency. The thick ceramic walls absorbed heat and held it with a stability that no metal grill could match. Temperatures were precise and consistent. The sealed environment retained moisture perfectly. You could smoke a brisket for 18 hours and it would emerge with a bark and a tenderness that seemed almost impossible. Fisher called his creation the Big Green Egg. It became the centerpiece of a devoted cult following, the kind of passionate community that gathers at festivals, shares obsessively detailed technique notes, and treats the cooker with something approaching reverence. There are Big Green Egg cooking clubs. There are Big Green Egg tattoos. There is a large annual festival in Atlanta called EGGT Oberfest. It is, by any measure, one of the more unexpected cultural phenomena of the late 20th century, and it traces its lineage directly to Japanese clay cooking vessels, which themselves descend from thousands of years of Asian cooking tradition. And then there's the pellet grill, the invention that came directly from a ruined family dinner. Joe Traeger was an Oregon businessman in the mid-1980s who sold wood pellet heating stoves, compact, efficient home heating units that burned compressed wood pellets fed by an automated mechanical system called an auger. One evening, a grease flare-up ruined a dinner he was cooking for his family. Frustrated, he started thinking about whether the same auger and pellet technology from his heating stoves could be applied to cooking. The principle was straightforward in theory but genuinely clever in execution. Instead of cooking over a direct flame that could flare unpredictably, you would burn wood pellets in a small enclosed fire pot, fed automatically by an auger that delivered a precise and consistent fuel supply. The cooker would maintain its temperature electronically. You would set the dial and the machine would handle the rest. Traeger patented the design in 1985 and began selling pellet grills through local hardware stores. The product was ahead of its time, the technology existed, but the market wasn't quite ready. Traeger's company struggled for years. But the patent ran out in 2006, and that's when everything changed. Other manufacturers poured into the market with their own designs. Competition drove innovation. Pellet grills got bigger, smarter, and cheaper. Today, a high-end pellet grill is essentially a wood-fired computer. You can monitor and control the temperature from your phone. You can receive alerts when your meat reaches a specific internal temperature. Some models have integrated meat probes that communicate wirelessly with the auger to automatically adjust fuel delivery and maintain exact cooking conditions. You can smoke a pork shoulder overnight, go to sleep, and wake up to perfectly cooked meat, managed by an algorithm that is running continuous calculations on airflow, pellet consumption, and thermal dynamics. 2 million years ago, our ancestors crouched over open fire. Today, we're managing combustion with Wi-Fi. And yet, and this is the part that I find genuinely moving, none of that technology has actually changed the ritual itself. Not really. People still gather around the fire. They still stand close to the smoke. They still argue about technique and seasoning and which wood gives the best flavor. They still use the act of cooking outside, over heat, to signal something important, that this moment matters, that these people matter, that we are going to slow down and feed each other and be together for a while. That impulse is older than language. It's older than agriculture. It's older than civilization. It is, in the most literal sense, what made us human, but we also can't tell this story honestly without sitting with some uncomfortable truths. The techniques that define barbecue culture, the slow smoking, the pit cooking, the regional flavor traditions of the American South, were developed by people who were enslaved, who were never compensated, who were written out of the history books. The word barbecue itself is borrowed from a people who were nearly annihilated. The tandoor, the braai, the asado, the kamado, all of these come from non-European cultures that have not always received the credit they deserve in the Western food media that has grown up around grilling, knowing that history doesn't diminish the joy of standing over a grill on a summer afternoon. If anything, it deepens it. It connects you to something larger than yourself, to enslaved pit masters in 18th century Virginia who tended their fires through the night with nothing but skill and memory, to Taíno people on a Caribbean island who built the first barbacoa thousands of years before anyone wrote it down, to nameless ancestors in Africa who first held meat over a flame and changed the course of human history forever. So the next time you fire up your grill, whether it's a classic Weber kettle with a bag of Kingsford briquettes, or a ceramic egg holding steady at 250 degrees, or a pellet smoker you're monitoring from your phone while you watch TV, take a second before you put the food on. Just stand there for a moment. Feel the heat on your face. Smell the smoke. You are participating in a ritual that is 2 million years old. You are connected, in a very real and unbroken line, to every human being who ever gathered around fire to cook and eat and be together. That line runs through enslaved men in Carolina pit yards. It runs through Taíno villages on Caribbean beaches. It runs through tandoor builders in the Indus Valley and coal-fire masters in medieval Baghdad and asadors on the Argentine pampas. The technology changes. The fire doesn't. And neither do we.